This talk, the seventh in the series, looks at some miscellaneous connections between Titanic and the city of Dundee in Scotland. James Scrimgeour Mann was born in Dundee on the 30th of August 1883 in the family home at 9 Viewforth Street. This street did not appear on the map of the 1872 survey, but its location is here marked with an X, where the Perth Road joins Hawk Hill. However, it appears on the map of 1886-87, and on the 1901 Ordnance Survey of Dundee, it is named Viewforth Place, as seen here by the red arrow. It has now disappeared as a separate street and forms the southern end of Blackness Avenue, as seen by the red line on this slide. His father was shipmaster James Smith Mann, and his mother was Marjorie Peter. His father was master of the Dundee barque Orion until his death in 1901. The younger James Mann later moved to Cheshire with his mother and siblings. He saw active service in the First World War, and the wound he sustained caused him to walk with a limp for the rest of his life. He was an accomplished marine artist and did work for the White Star Line, as well as the Cunard Line and the Bibby Line. He attended the Liverpool School of Art, the same institution that John Lennon attended many years later. He exhibited at the Royal Academy of Arts, the Royal Society of British Artists, the Royal Institute of Painters in Watercolours, and the Royal Glasgow Institute of Fine Arts. He was elected to the Royal Cambrian Academy in 1932 and served as its president in 1942. He died in Wales, aged 62, on the 1st of June 1946. As part of his work with the White Star Line, Mr. Mann produced an artistic rendition of the sister ships Olympic and Titanic. The work is dated to around 1911 and was likely completed before the ships were officially launched. This painting is of Olympic, recognisable by our unenclosed upper deck, but the mention of Titanic on the surrounding text makes this a very rare collector's item. The poster was printed by T. Foreman and Sons, Nottingham. One interesting feature on the poster was the presence of a military vessel at the bow of Titanic. It is thought this touch by the artist was to serve as a visual support to reinforce Britain's overall domination of the seas. It can also be seen that the picture of the ship is surrounded by a mat with writing giving information about the ship in the picture. In this slide the writing is in English, but the mat is shown with Swedish writing, suggesting that the White Star Line used the image of the Olympic to promote these sister ships in different countries by changing the mat to reflect the information in different languages. 2 copies of the poster came up for auction at the Swan Galleries in New York City. The first was auctioned on November 19, 2015 and sold for a hammer price of $8,500, which is £5,491 sterling, with the buyer's premium bringing the price up to $10,625 or £6,864. The second one was auctioned on the 26th of October 2017 and sold for a hammer price of $7,500, which would be equivalent of £4,843. The next item concerns David Blair, who was born on the 11th of November 1874 in Newport on the Isle of Wight. His connection to Dundee centres around his marriage to Madeline Temple Macnas on the 2nd of September 1905 in a private chapel in Ferry, a suburb of Dundee. At that time he had an address of 11 Newington Terrace on the esplanade between Brook Street and Panmure Street in Ferry. He died on the 10th of January 1955 in Hendon, Middlesex. Returning to the Titanic story, Mr. Blair was replaced as an officer on Titanic by the Chief Officer of Olympic, Henry Wilde, pictured here. He was transferred to Titanic before her maiden voyage from Southampton. Mr. Blair had been an officer on Titanic for her sea trials and the voyage from Belfast to Southampton. His notoriety as the man who unwittingly sunk Titanic stems from 2 pieces of testimony. One was given at the British Inquiry by George Hogg, pictured here, who was a lookout on Titanic. Mr. Hogg testified that on the trip from Belfast to Southampton, Mr. Blair had loaned him a pair of binoculars. Upon Titanic's arrival at Southampton, Mr. Blair had been in the crow's nest himself using the binoculars. Mr. Hogg then stated that Mr. Blair had asked him to lock the binoculars in his, that is Blair's cabin, and return the keys to him. Hogg locked the binoculars in the cabin as instructed and gave the key to a man named Weller to return to Mr. Blair. The other piece of testimony was given by this man, Frederick Fleet, at the American inquiry. Mr. Fleet was one of the lookouts on the night the Titanic sank. When he was asked whether binoculars would have helped him see the iceberg from further away, he replied that he would have seen it a bit sooner. When asked how much sooner, he responded, "Well, enough to get out of the way." A legend grew up around these two pieces of testimony, where the perception was that David Blair had taken a key from Titanic when he left the ship prior to her maiden voyage. The loss of this key resulted in no binoculars being available for the lookouts in the Crow's Nest, and the lack of binoculars was a contributing factor to the sinking of the ship. The truth does not bear this accusation. Firstly, the key Mr. Hogg spoke about was for a locker in Mr. Blair's cabin and not for the Crow's Nest. Secondly, even if the Crow's Nest key had been taken, there must have been more than one key for the Crow's Nest telephone housing, as this phone was used by Frederick Fleet to give the iceberg dead ahead warning. Mr. Blair kept the key as memento, and it was sold for auction by Henry Aldridge at Devizes, Wiltshire for £90,000 in September 2007, accompanied by a postcard written by David Blair on the 4th of April 1912. Note the Broughty Ferry address on the postcard. So did the lack of these binoculars contribute to the sinking? There were 4 or 5 pairs of binoculars on board Titanic during the voyage. Any of these could have been acquired by the lookouts if they really felt they needed them to increase the chance of seeing ice. The official findings of the British inquiry held that glasses were not necessary, and the International Safety of Life at Sea SOLAS Convention that followed in 1914, and which resulted in many landmark changes to maritime safety, affirmed this as well. An excellent review of the usefulness of binoculars in a situation such as Titanic found herself on the 14th of April 1912 can be found online at Encyclopedia Titanica, the article being written by Art Braunschweiger. The next item concerns a man called James Rattray. He was born on the 14th of May 1884 at 2 Gardeners Lane, Dundee. This was the home of his parents, James Hutchison Rattray and Margaret Fleming. They were married at Denhead Liff near Dundee on June 22nd, 1883. In the 1901 census, the family had moved to 9 Ladywell Place, Victoria Road, Dundee, and James Jr. was listed as being an apprentice fitter. In the 1911 census, the family had moved to 17 Victoria Road, and James Jr. is not listed as living there with the family. The link of this family to Titanic is revealed by an article that appeared in the Dundee Courier dated Friday the 17th of May 1912. The article explained that James Rattray was a bit of a nomad and had run away to sea at an early age. After that he came and went as he pleased. At the time of the Titanic disaster, his family had not seen him for about 2 years, and when his mother heard of the sinking, she had a feeling he was on board the doomed liner. The Courier article further reported that one night around this time, a neighbour had brought in a copy of the Saturday Post newspaper and asked Mrs. Rattray if she knew anyone in a photograph of Titanic survivors taken at Southampton that was in the newspaper. Mrs. Rattray apparently exclaimed at seeing the photograph, "If that's not my son, I never had a son." The picture apparently showed a group of firemen from the Titanic, with James Rattray smiling at the end of the group. Now, the possible Saturdays that the edition of the Saturday Post that Mrs. Rattray saw could have been published were the 20th and 27th of April and the 4th, 11th and 17th of May. Looking at the Saturday Post on these dates, only 2 photographs were found with survivors from the Titanic. One was from May the 4th, 1912, and the other from May the 11th, 1912. Neither of these photographs seems to correspond to the description given in the Courier article of a man smiling at the end of a group of firemen. If there is another picture, it cannot as yet be found. There are a couple of inaccuracies in the Courier article. Firstly, the description of James as being born in a tenement in the east end of the city is incorrect. Gardeners Lane is at the west end of Dundee. Secondly, his age is quoted at 24, when in fact he was 27 when the Titanic sank and the article was written. But the biggest problem was that nobody with the name James Rattray appears on the crew or passenger list of Titanic. There are many examples of people travelling on Titanic under assumed names. The most famous was Michel Navratil, shown here, who kidnapped his own children, Michel and Edmond, and sailed with them on Titanic as Louis Hoffman. Did James Rattray do the same? There is a tantalising comment from a researcher's point of view made by Mrs. Rattray and quoted in the Courier article. She is reported as saying that she recognised, and I quote, a name which had been known to use on the list of survivors. However, a close and detailed examination of the survivors list has failed to show anyone that fits the characteristics of James Rattray. The possible explanations of all this are that the whole story is a complete fabrication, or his mother made a mistake in identifying him in the photograph. However, the most likely explanation is that James was hanging around the docks in Southampton and joined some of the crew of Titanic who he had known from previous voyages. However, the problem remains that the picture central to the story itself cannot be identified with certainty. I would now like to talk about two Dundonians who claimed to be near the site where Titanic foundered on that fateful night. John Henry was born in Westport, Dundee, shown here on the 22nd of April 1863. He married Margaret Carruthers at Bell Street Church on the 11th of September 1889. Sadly, Margaret died at the Dundee District Asylum at Liff, shown here, on the 6th of July 1904 from pulmonary tuberculosis. Mr. Henry remarried again at Jane Stevenson or Jane Dick on the 7th of September 1906, and they lived at 21 Hill Street, Dundee. Mr. Henry became a marine stoker. John Patrick Mannion was born at 25 Crescent Lane, Dundee on the 16th of January 1878. He married Margaret Bissett and they lived at 22 Todburn Lane, Dundee. Again, he also became a marine stoker. In April 1912, both were firemen on the cargo ship Monarch, shown here. Monarch was built at the Wallsend yard of C.S. Swan and Hunter Limited and was launched on the 1st of July 1897. It was a steel-hulled vessel with a single screw and a maximum speed of 10 knots. In April 1912, she was on a voyage from New Orleans to Liverpool. When the boat docked at Liverpool on Sunday the 21st of April, the crew became aware of the sinking of Titanic. The Dundee Courier interviewed the two crew members of the Monarch from Dundee. They said they must have been close to the scene at the time of the Titanic disaster, certainly not more than 20 miles off. They added that at least 100 lives could have been saved and admitted to seeing only one iceberg, which they did not regard as a big one. So was the Monarch near Titanic at the time of the sinking, or were the two firemen that were interviewed just exhibiting that human desire to be part of, however peripherally, any great event, be it good or bad? Let's look at the likelihood of their story. If the Monarch was near the site of Titanic's demise, the ship would have travelled 2,057 miles from April 1415 to docking in Liverpool on the 21st of April. Top speed of Monarch was 12 knots, but it usually travelled at 10 knots. Therefore, it should have arrived in Liverpool on the 23rd of April, not 2 days before. Therefore, it's unlikely that Monarch was near the site of the sinking on the night in question. The other factor against the firemen's claim was the fact they saw only one iceberg. Carpathia, the ship that rescued the survivors from Titanic, came from the south and encountered a lot of ice. The Californian, as we saw in the first of these talks, was stopped in ice to the north of Titanic. The Mount Temple was another ship steaming to Titanic's aid from the west, and it encountered a field of ice. Therefore, it's unlikely that Monarch was 20 miles off Titanic's sinking site on the night in question. We'll never know for sure, but the evidence we have is against it. More details about the various topics in this talk can be found in the book Dundee Man Lost at Sea. There are also other miscellaneous connections between Titanic and the city of Dundee discussed in this book. It's available from Amazon and Kindle. The final talk on this series will be available soon. Thank you.